When this hiker stumbles upon a bear, she is scared until she realizes that it is used to the company of humans and only wants her to follow. When she does, her whole life changes. At 29, Twiggy had recently lost both her parents in a freak automobile accident. Coming to terms with her loss was taking longer than she had expected. Her emotional wounds were still raw, but being in the woods among the trees helped. Here, she could be alone with her thoughts and cry whenever she felt like it, knowing that no one could hear her and question her sanity. But suddenly, a rustle in the underbrush caught her attention. She halted instinctively, ready to apologize to whoever was around for her sudden burst of sobs. Her eyes scanned her surroundings for the source of the sound. But when she found it, the apology died at the back of her throat. There, standing in the dappled sunlight, was a black bear. It was a massive creature with fur as dark as the shadows that danced around it. Twiggy's heart quickened. She felt a mix of fear and fascination gripping her. A black bear out in this corner of the woods was unusual, but it still spelled danger for her. However, the bear exhibited strange behavior. Instead of retreating into the trees or attacking, it stepped forward, fixing its dark eyes on Twiggy. The bear stared at her, motionless. At first, she wasn't sure what to do next. Running was not an option. Neither was showing fear. She could stand her ground, but if the bear decided she was unwelcome and charged, then all bets were off. Intrigued and cautious, Twiggy took a step closer. The bear turned its head, and that's when Twiggy saw the weathered collar around its neck for the first time. It was the type of collar conservation officials put on an animal if they want to track it or plot its whereabouts in protected areas. The leather was cracked and faded, and Twiggy thought whoever had placed it on the bear had lost interest in the animal years ago. The huge animal swayed from side to side for a few long moments and then took a step forward. Twiggy stood her ground. Then the bear took another 3 steps. Still, Twiggy stood her ground. She could smell the animal now, and the closer it came, the more she became aware of its size. Then, the bear was right before her, no more than a foot away. She dared to extend her arm and slid her hand onto the bear's head to feel around for the collar. She was right. It was old. The leather had hardened and cracked, and it had a small pouch attached to it. This piqued Twiggy's interest. The bear seemed as comfortable as it had ever been and sat down with a grunt. Where did it come from? The bear had been around humans for a long time, of that she was sure. But it had also been living in the wild for a long while. The state of the leather collar told her that. And then there was the pouch on the collar. This was out of the ordinary. Usually, these collars were affixed with rivets and a radio transmitter was sealed inside the collar. But this collar was different. It had no transmitter. She let her fingers slide around the collar, under the bear's chin, and then the other side. Nope, she was right. No radio transmitter. Her fingers started fiddling with the clasp on the tiny leather pouch. She managed to unclip it and felt around inside. It was empty except for directions to a cottage up against the slope of the mountain. How strange, she thought. Twiggy was instantly perplexed. She knew the place. She'd hiked past the dilapidated structure a few times and had always assumed it was abandoned. She'd never seen a living thing around the cottage. Each time she'd been up that way, it seemed as if time stood still around that place. There was none of the chirping birds that made up the soundtrack of the rest of the woods. No signs of animals. Even the breeze had always disappeared when she approached the area. Twiggy looked closer. There was a small metal tag attached to the bear's collar. It had an inscription engraved on it. Buddy. That was clearly the bear's name. "You're Buddy," she said. "That's your name, right?" The bear looked straight up at her when he heard his name. "Okay," she said, smiling. "Now we figured that out, but what about the rest? There's a whole mystery here, buddy." It was a long hike up to the cottage, and Twiggy wasn't geared for it. She'd planned a short hike for the day and had none of the essentials she would have brought if she had known she'd be heading up to high ground. But she decided to go anyway. If darkness caught up with her, she'd break a window and overnight in the cottage. Then she'd leave some money and a note explaining the situation. Little did she know that this decision would not only lead her to a hidden chapter of someone else's life, but also weave her own story into the intricate tapestry of grief, healing, and unexpected connections. With the faded note clutched in her hand, Twiggy set forth in the direction of the high forest. The silence was broken only by the occasional crunch of leaves beneath her boots. As she navigated through the woods with the bear a few steps ahead of her, a mix of anticipation and trepidation accompanied every step. As the forest thinned, it revealed a clearing bathed in the soft glow of twilight. Before her was the weather-beaten cottage. Its windows were dirty and its roof sagged under the weight of time. Nature was in the process of reclaiming this space. Twiggy first knocked on the door. As she expected, there was no reply. Then, she walked around the cottage and tried to peer into the windows. The inside was huddled in a murky darkness. Behind her, Buddy seemed right at home. The connection between the bear and the cottage was palpable. It was as if he was the guardian of the memories this eerie place harbored. While she looked around the cottage for clues, the bear simply sat in front of the door and pawed at it, moaning softly. That's when Twiggy finally realized the reason why he had approached her in the wild. There was a lock on the door, and he was stuck outside, on the other side of something that must be very important for him. It took Twiggy all of 15 seconds to gain entry. The lock on the front door was completely rusted, and it gave way when she struck it with a log. Inside the desolate home, Twiggy discovered traces of a family. Furniture was draped in dusty yellow sheets, and photographs on the mantelpiece were dusty and frozen in time. The atmosphere hung heavy with a sense of abandonment. As she looked around in awe and confusion, Buddy made his way through the cottage with confident steps. He sniffed around the rooms, stopping to touch some blankets and pillows. It was like he was smelling the scent of a loved one in there, and Twiggy couldn't help but feel sorry for him. Where was everyone? In the kitchen, she found 2 oil lamps and an old can of fuel. She blew the dust from the kitchen table and placed them in the center for later. Then, she started to snoop. There were 2 bedrooms in the cottage and a living area that was open to a kitchen, and another fireplace in the living room had the remnants of age-old, half-burned logs inside. Whoever lived here had left without straightening the place up. Perhaps they intended to return and some calamity had befallen them. Or perhaps they had left to never return and thought the idea of cleaning up the place was superfluous. Twiggy found dusty photo albums, a bunch of journals, and faded letters on a bookshelf in the bedroom. She flicked through them, deciding to read them at the kitchen table later. As she walked around, the bear stayed on her heels as if it were a shadow sewn to her. It made bear sounds and grunts as if it was in a deep conversation with either her or itself. After a while, Twiggy dragged an old chair onto the porch and settled down to enjoy the last daylight in the fresh air. The bear unceremoniously picked a spot beside her. "How odd, the 2 of us," she told the bear. "I wish you could tell me your story. What you're doing here, why you're so comfortable with humans, and why you approached me in the woods earlier. I have questions, Buddy, and somehow we have to find the answers." As if to underline the importance of what she had said, she stroked the bear's head. It looked up at her, and for a moment, she thought the animal was communicating with her. It was as if he was telling her to be patient, that all the answers would be revealed. As darkness fell outside, Twiggy lit the oil lamps and settled down at the kitchen table with the paper she had found. Buddy tried to slither in under the table, but he was way too large. She shooed him away, and after a couple of circles, he collapsed in front of the hearth. When she opened the first journal and started reading, Twiggy was immediately spellbound. The neat handwriting told the story of a happy family. There was a father, he was called Jack. The mother was called Clementine, and there was a little girl of 5 called Genevieve. This was their holiday cottage. The diary told in vivid detail about the happy times they spent at the cottage. Then, Buddy made his first appearance in the tale. He had lost his mother and twin brother in a poaching incident, and Genevieve had found and hand-reared him. According to the diary, they were fast friends. Twiggy immersed herself in the experiences of the family, almost feeling like she was reading the story of her own life. Jack was remarkably similar to her own dad, and Clementine was her mother to a T. And when she read the parts about Genevieve, it was as if she was reading about herself. Through the diary, Twiggy escaped deep into a world that felt strangely familiar to her. She put the journal aside and opened a photo album. A current of electricity spiraled up her spine as she looked at a picture of the family together. It was faded and yellow, but still looked almost exactly like her own family. Jack was almost identical to her father. Clementine had her mother's smile and eyes, even though she wore her hair differently, and Genevieve looked exactly like her 10-year-old self. Twiggy slammed the album shut, not sure what to make of it. She opened 2 cans of spaghetti and tomato sauce, found a bowl, and emptied one for Buddy. He stood up laboriously and ambled over. The food disappeared in one gulp. Buddy looked at her to make sure that was it, then turned and sagged onto the floor in front of the hearth again. Once she'd eaten, Twiggy turned to the journals again. Something was going on, and she didn't quite understand it yet. The family's story was eerily close to her own, and the people in the picture looked exactly like her and her folks. The next journal picked the story up a lot later. Genevieve was almost 20 now, but the family was still as tight as they'd been in the first journal. They still holidayed together at the college, and the time they spent together was still any young girl's dream. But then, the handwriting changed. Genevieve had taken over the journal entries from Clementine, and suddenly, the story was filled with immeasurable sadness. Jack and Clementine had been killed in a car crash. Genevieve was all alone now. Twiggy could picture her sitting at the kitchen table where she was sitting now, cloaked in her sorrow and trying to make sense of her loss and future. With tears running down her cheeks, Twiggy continued to read Genevieve's journal entries. She wrote about her intense heartache, the struggle to come to terms with her loss, her long, almost daily walks in the woods to try to find a modicum of peace, and the bleakness she felt each time she thought of her future. And she wrote a lot about Buddy. In this time of inconsolable grief, the bear had been her pillar of strength, her constant companion, a savior of sorts. But Genevieve was gone too now, and Buddy was all alone. Had he chosen to approach her because of her similarity to the best friend he had lost? She would never know. Twiggy cried irrepressibly. She hadn't written these pages, but she might as well have. During the night, she sobbed non-stop and buried herself in Genevieve's story. It was as if they were long-lost friends, comrades on the same journey. Twiggy felt as if her soul rubbed against Genevieve's. Through this stranger, she came face to face with every sliver of her own heartache, and with Genevieve's words in her ears, she stared shamelessly at every doubt she'd ever had, every moment she'd been ready to give up, and every bit of anxiety that threatened all the time to overwhelm her. Each emotion Genevieve wrote about, Twiggy felt as if it were her own. Each anecdote was similar to something she had experienced in her life. She was too tired to even realize how eerie it was. Eventually, Twiggy nodded off at the table. Somewhere during the night, she made her way to the bed and fell into a deep, restless sleep. The next morning, the world seemed different to Twiggy. She awoke in the strange bed, stretched, and found her bearings. In the kitchen, Buddy was nowhere to be seen. She brewed a mug of instant coffee and headed onto the porch. Still no sign of the bear. Twiggy called a couple of times, now a little concerned. The front door hadn't been open, and she couldn't figure out how Buddy made his way outside. But somehow, he managed. In the east, wisps of clouds were gathering. That meant rain. If clouds started gathering there, stormy, unpredictable weather was bound to follow, and follow soon. She had to leave soon if she was going to make it down the mountain and out of the woods by the time the sluices of heaven opened. But where was Buddy? By midday, Twiggy couldn't leave it any longer. She slipped the last of the journals, the ones she hadn't read yet, into her backpack and started heading down the mountain in the hope that Buddy would find and join her. To her surprise, she was feeling good for the first time since her parents had died. It was as if Genevieve's shared story had brought so much healing into her own heart. The world didn't seem so hostile anymore. The emotional weight she'd been carrying since her parents' death was gone, and she was actually looking forward to seeing people when she got home. Twiggy smiled when she broke free of the woods and saw the little town in the distance. Buddy was gone, but she would head up the mountain again soon to see if she could find him. Later that morning, she invited a few of the elderly women in the village for tea for the first time in 2 years. Over lemon biscuits and Earl Grey, she relayed her adventures of the previous day. When she started talking about the journals, she produced the single, unread binder from her backpack. The older women paged through it with oohs and ahs until one held up her hand. "Something doesn't match up," she said. She held up the journal in one hand. "There's a date on the front. It's 1958. That means it couldn't have been the same bear, Twiggy. Bears don't live that long." Again, electricity spiraled up Twiggy's spine. The woman was right. Bears don't live that long. But the bear she'd met was Buddy, all right. She knew it from the way he was right at home at the cottage, the way he had hung around and made himself at home, as if he had lived there all his life. And she knew it from his name tag. Suddenly, Twiggy knew something magical had happened in the forest, something that had been designed to help her to heal. She had no idea what it was, but judging by the lightness she was experiencing for the very first time in almost 2 years, it was very, very real. What a lovely ending! It was as if the entire natural world was mystically conspiring to help Twiggy heal from her heartbreak. Do you have a story where something so profound happened that you have no way of explaining it? Please tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear. For now though, we're out of here. Catch you in the next video.